real GDP down here below. What comfortable is that when we put the quantity, and that's what the Q stands for, quantity of goods and services, that we have really a proxy for real gross domestic product. Let me draw the aggregate supply curve and then I'll give you a definition. Aggregate supply, and why don't I label this SRAS? This is the short run aggregate supply curve. We'll talk about what makes it short run and long term and so forth later on. And I've just labeled this aggregate supply up here, the curve itself, but I want you to know that's a short run aggregate supply curve. The aggregate supply curve is a curve showing various quantities of real GDP, that is to say newly produced goods and services, that will be offered for sale price levels. And you can see exactly that as the price level changes. You can see that there are price level going up, higher price level, larger level of goods and services offered for sale. This is not a microeconomic curve. We talked about microeconomic supply and demand before. This is not a microeconomic curve. This is saying that the entire economy, as the price level goes up, or I should say here, as the price level goes up, then producers throughout the economy, different goods and services, basketballs and dinner and buildings and shoes and whatever you can imagine, that they start offering more and more goods for sale. Why is that? Profit per unit equals price per unit minus cost per unit. Let's talk about this, and then we'll understand why there's this upward sloping curve. Profit per unit is just the difference between what price do you charge and what's your cost on a per unit basis. Suppose the price per unit rises. This is per unit of what? Per unit of Q, goods and services. Suppose the price level goes up. Now, you're going to have to take my word for it right here, and then we'll come back and talk about it more later, but take my word for this. These costs don't change very fast. Here's what happens, and then we'll sort of go on, but here's what happens out there in the real world is workers will go in and bargain with their employers for wages, and sometimes, particularly if it's a union, they might bargain 3 or 4 years out. Something might happen like the auto workers union would go to Ford and General Motors and Chrysler and so forth and bargain on wages, and they may say something like this: okay, we get $15 an hour this year, next year we'll go up to $16 an hour, the next year $17 an hour, and the next year $18 an hour. Deal? Deal. Shake hands. That's our deal. And so we start at 15, 16, 17, 18, and that's locked in. And so cost per unit, that's just a fixed amount. How about the building that Ford or General Motors is in? They paid for that building several years ago. The cost per unit of producing cars, the rent doesn't go up on the building. So there's the two most important ingredients in producing most goods and services is you got your, like the cost of rent, and you got your employees. And what I'm saying is the employee wages, those are kind of fixed for a year or 2 or 3 or whatever. And I have a contract that starts every year, what would be in mid-August, and takes me through the next year mid-August, and I start another year. But we don't get together like at Christmas and where, you know, my boss goes, you know, you did a heck of a good job teaching that class, and I just wanted to give you an extra 5% bonus. We don't have any bonuses like that. I teach that 12 months for whatever I started the year off at. And the next year, I hope it goes up, but if it doesn't, it doesn't. But we don't have any intra-year bargains. And I'm saying in many industries, they have even longer term deals. So the cost per unit is fixed. And so now, if the price per unit goes up, then what that means is profit per unit went up. If we started off charging, let's say, $1, and the cost per unit is 50 cents, we had a profit per unit of 50 cents. These are just for illustration. But I'm saying if this price goes up to $1.10, now profits went up to 60 cents because those costs don't change by very much. So if the aggregate price level rises, the per unit profit rises, and incentives being what they are, producers say, oh, profit per unit up, well, let's produce some more. Let's work the workers overtime. Let's do whatever we can do. Let's add on to the building if we can, but let's do whatever we can do to take advantage of the rising profit per unit. So here we have the upward sloping aggregate supply curve. This is short run. And like I say, we'll come back and talk about what is long run later on. Okay? We also, and this is the same with respect to aggregate supply and demand as the microeconomic supply and demand. We always want to distinguish between a movement along the curve, and here's what I'm seeing here is we move along the curve if the price level changes. Higher price level, larger quantity of real GDPs being supplied, but we're moving along the curve. We want to distinguish between a movement along the curve, which can only be caused by a change in the price level. By the way, it was the same thing with the aggregate demand curve. To move from one point to another along the aggregate demand curve, that would only be caused by a change in the price level. And then everything else, those things we talked about earlier about changes in household wealth and changes in interest rates and so forth, those shift the curve. We move along the curve if there's a change in the price level. Okay. So anyway, we've got that curve. What we want to do now is, did I skip anything that I want to talk about? No, I don't think so. What we want to do now is talk about what will cause the curve to shift. What shifts the aggregate supply curve? Number one, a change in wages. And by the way, well, maybe you should know this, but let me remind you, in case you don't know it, I want this to be real clear to you. If you'll go back in your notes and look, and you don't actually have to do that right now, but I'm just saying at some point, we had a list of the entries into national income. We talked about compensation of employees. We talked about proprietors' income. We talked about corporate income or corporate profits. We talked about interest. And we talked about rent, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We talked about those. And if you'll go back and look at the numbers I gave you, by far and away the biggest item of national income, by far and away the biggest form of factor income or resource income is compensation of employees. And here we are talking about aggregate supply. What can cause that aggregate supply curve to shift? What I'm telling you